All right, today we're cracking open the works of the historian Josephus for what is, essentially, a classic David versus Goliath story, but with a Roman twist. This is the tale of a Judean prince who decided to raise an army and take on the Roman Republic for his throne. It was a massive gamble, and it was going to end in blood. Let's break down how it all went down.
So, let's set the scene. We're in Judea, 1st century BCE, and the whole region is walking this incredible political tightrope. Sure, it has a kind of self-rule, but it exists completely under the shadow of the ever-expanding Roman Republic. That line on the screen says it all. Peace here isn't earned, it's bought. It's a fragile stability that only holds up as long as everyone remembers who's really in charge.
Now, before we can even get to the rebellion, you have to understand the system it was rebelling against. And Josephus, our source for all this, gives us the perfect case study, a story about a Roman general's little expedition into Arabia.
This timeline right here, it lays out the power dynamic perfectly. The Roman general scours, he marches into Arabia, but he gets stuck. The terrain is rough and his army is literally starving. So who bails him out? The local Judean leadership, High Priest Hyrcanus and his advisor, a guy named Antipater. And they don't just send supplies. Antipater actually brokers a deal where the Arabian king pays the Romans a massive sum, 300 talents of silver, just to get them to leave. Think about who wins here. Rome gets paid for a failed invasion, and the local leaders get to prove just how useful they are. This whole system creates what we call a client ruler. And as you can see, these guys like Hyrcanus and Antipater, they weren't exactly independent kings, not at all. They held their power because Rome let them. Their whole job was to keep things quiet, keep the money flowing, and help out Rome whenever needed, just like they did in Arabia. For Rome, this was brilliant. It was cheap, it meant fewer Roman soldiers on the ground, and it kept the local elites focused on serving Roman interests. Their power, even their survival, was completely tied to how useful they were to Rome.
But, not everyone was a fan of this arrangement. And this is where our main character, Alexander, enters the picture. He's a prince from a rival branch of the royal family. His dad had been kicked out by Rome, and he sees the current leadership as nothing more than Roman puppets. He's not interested in being a client, he wants to be a king.
So what you have here is a classic showdown between two totally different ideas of power. On one side, you've got Hyrcanus. His authority comes from a permission slip signed by Rome. On the other side is Alexander, who believes real power comes from his bloodline, and, of course, from the end of a sword.
And don't get it twisted, Alexander was a serious threat. Josephus tells us he managed to raise a pretty big force, 11,500 men. I mean, this wasn't some minor scuffle. This was a full-scale army, ready to fight for control of the entire kingdom.
And he was smart about it too. He wasn't just marching out into an open field. He started rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, the same walls the Romans had torn down before. That's a huge symbolic move, a real middle finger to the establishment. He also locked down and fortified these key mountain strongholds. Alexander was digging in, preparing for a long, ugly war against a superpower.
Well, you just knew Rome wasn't going to let this slide, right? Of course not. A new governor, Aulus Gabinius, is sent to Syria. And with him is a young, ambitious cavalry commander, a name you're probably going to recognize, Marcus Antonius. Yep, that Mark Antony. And this is where you really see the Roman strategy at its most clever and its most brutal. Gabinius doesn't just show up with his legions, he rallies Rome's local allies. As you can see in this table, you've got Roman commanders working side by side with forces loyal to Antipater and other local bigwigs. It's a classic divide-and-conquer move, designed to crush the rebellion by turning Judean against Judean, all to keep Rome in control.
So Alexander, even with his big army, he takes one look at this combined force and he knows he's outgunned. Josephus puts it pretty plainly right here. He just couldn't handle the charge. Faced with this united enemy, he did the only thing he could do to survive. He fell back, a strategic retreat.
But you can only run for so long, right? The Roman and allied forces were relentless. They hunted him down, and they forced the very confrontation he had been trying to avoid. The fate of his entire rebellion was about to be decided in one single, brutal battle.
And the location? Wow. It couldn't have been more dramatic. The final battle took place right near Jerusalem, the very prize Alexander was fighting so hard to win back. Everything was on the line, right there.
So this is the big question, isn't it? Could the passion, the sheer numbers of a rebel army, actually stand a chance against the organized, professional, disciplined war machine of Rome and its local allies?
The answer was a brutal, decisive, and bloody no. The outcome was just catastrophic for the rebels. Josephus gives us the grim math, and you can see it right here in the chart. 3,000 of Alexander's men were killed in the fighting, another 3,000 were captured.
Just let that number sink in for a second. 6,000 men. Gone. In one single battle. Alexander lost more than half of his entire army. It was an absolutely staggering defeat and a terrifying demonstration of Roman military efficiency.
So the battle was over, and with it, so was the dream of an independent Judea with Alexander on the throne. What came next was the cold, hard reality of what happens when you challenge an empire and lose. The rebellion was just crushed, utterly. Alexander, with what was left of his shattered army, less than half of what he started with, had no choice but to flee back to one of those mountain fortresses he'd prepared. His big gamble for the throne had ended in a bloody failure.
And this whole story leaves us with this final nagging question. We see two paths here, right? Antipater and Hyrcanus chose loyalty, they played the game, and they kept their power, their money, and their lives. Alexander chose defiance. He inspired thousands, but in the end, he was broken. So it really makes you wonder, when you're faced with an overwhelming power like Rome, is loyalty just a practical choice for survival, or is it really the only choice you have?